He wrote songs that made the world cry. She lit up every room she walked into. But after 7 years of quiet love, Chris Martin let Dakota Johnson go. Not with drama, not with headlines, just silence. So what really happened behind the closed doors of Hollywood's most private relationship? It didn't begin with fireworks, no red carpets, no viral photos, just a quiet dinner in Los Angeles and two people who understood each other in ways that words couldn't explain. Chris Martin, world famous, emotionally guarded, father of two, wasn't chasing attention. Dakota Johnson, charming, quietly intense, growing into her own light, wasn't looking for fame either. Maybe that's why it worked. At first, their relationship stayed under the radar for months. No couple selfies, no tabloid scandals. While the world speculated, they stayed silent. And when you stay silent in Hollywood, it usually means one of two things. You're hiding something or you're protecting something. By the time fans caught on, they had already built a home together, a life tucked away in Malibu. No wedding bells, no big announcements, just 7 years of private love, soft boundaries, and carefully drawn lines. And yet, in every quiet moment, something was shifting, something they didn't speak about, not to the public, and maybe not even to each other, because behind every perfect silence, there's usually a secret.
On the surface, it looked like a match made in serenity, but behind the closed doors of their Malibu home, two very different lives were unfolding. Chris Martin had already lived a lifetime. Grammy stages, global tours, a high-profile divorce with Gwyneth Paltrow, and fatherhood to two growing kids. His world had rhythm, but it was no longer wild. He was grounded, focused, comfortable in the quiet. Dakota, on the other hand, was just getting started. Her star was rising fast. Indie films, cult fashion status, the kind of momentum that doesn't slow down for comfort. She wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing meaning, roles that challenged her, projects that stretched her limits. And sometimes she needed to disappear for months just to find herself in a script. They loved each other, but their paths didn't always run side by side. He lived for mornings with his kids and long studio nights in London. She flew to Rome, to Berlin, to film sets halfway around the world. Schedules clashed, priorities shifted, and slowly, without either of them meaning to, they began living two different lives under the same roof. They weren't arguing. There was no scandal, just a quiet kind of distance, the one that sneaks in when you stop having the same destination. Love was still there, but sometimes love isn't enough when timing is everything. And for Chris and Dakota, the clock had already started ticking. From the outside, everything still looked peaceful, but in silence, pressure builds. And sometimes the loudest problems are the ones no one says out loud. There was an age gap, 13 years. At first, it didn't matter. He brought calm. She brought light. But over time, that difference started showing up in the small cracks. How they spent weekends. What they imagined 10 years from now. Chris had been through the fire. Marriage, fame, family. He had found peace in simplicity. Dakota was still exploring. New roles, creative risks, unspoken desires. They were at different emotional speeds, different chapters. People close to them began noticing the subtle distance. Some described it as very up and down. Others said they tried to make it work, but things weren't lining up. They didn't scream. They didn't slam doors. They just drifted, like two people reading different books in the same room, quietly, respectfully, but never quite on the same page. And while the world kept calling them goals, behind the scenes, things had already started falling apart. No betrayal, no explosion, just two hearts slowly fading out of sync. And the next fracture would come from something even more personal, something Dakota never spoke about publicly. Every love story faces a test. For Chris and Dakota, It was the future, something neither could fully control, but both felt deep in their bones. Dakota wanted a family. She dreamed of children, of a home filled with laughter and little footsteps. It was more than a hope. It was a quiet yearning she couldn't ignore. Chris, however, was already a father. 2 kids, grown and part of his world. And after everything he'd been through, he felt his family was complete. The thought of starting over? It wasn't in his plan. That unspoken difference carved a silent canyon between them. Sources close to the couple revealed she had expressed wanting children, while Chris was kind of done with that part of his life. Imagine the weight of that. The person you love wanting something you can't give. Not because you don't want to, but because your life's path has already taken you somewhere else. It wasn't just about babies. It was about timelines, life goals, and a future that simply didn't match. And in those quiet moments, the cracks deepened. Love alone wasn't enough to bridge what time had quietly pulled apart. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it fades quietly, like a song slowly losing volume until all that's left is an echo. Chris and Dakota had their share of ups and downs, brief splits, makeups, and moments of hope that maybe things could go back to the way they were. But every time they drifted apart, the distance grew a little wider. The familiar rhythm became harder to find. Insiders say this time felt different, more final. No more second chances. No more resets. Dakota was devastated, not just because of the breakup, but because it meant losing the daily presence in Chris's children's lives, a connection she had grown to love deeply. It wasn't a dramatic public fight or scandal, just 2 people, realizing that sometimes love means knowing when to let go. And while their story wasn't shouted from the rooftops, the pain was real, a soft, invisible fracture. But the story wasn't over, because even in goodbye, there are moments that speak louder than words. Just when the world thought this story was fading away, Chris Martin surprised everyone. His subtle public shout-out to Dakota during a Las Vegas show caught fans off guard. Was it a final goodbye? An apology? A quiet nod to what once was? On stage, under the bright lights, Chris whispered words that sounded like love and regret wrapped into one. A reminder that some bonds don't simply disappear. But this wasn't just about closure. It was a message, soft, almost hidden to the world, that despite everything, respect and affection remained. Rumors flew. Fans speculated endlessly. Yet, behind the scenes, it was a delicate dance of emotions. Too complex for headlines, too private for public eyes. In Hollywood, where everything feels loud and flashing, sometimes the most meaningful stories are told in silence. And for Chris Martin and Dakota Johnson, their silence said more than any tabloid ever could. Chris Martin and Dakota Johnson's story wasn't built on headlines or dramatic public fights. It was a quiet, complicated dance. 2 people loving deeply, but growing apart. Sometimes love means holding on. Sometimes it means knowing when to let go. But what happened after that Las Vegas moment? What does Chris's next chapter look like? And could Dakota's path be leading somewhere unexpected? Stay tuned, because the story behind the silence is far from over.